did change, I will say, but that's okay.
You're live. Hello, everyone. Welcome to DigiLabour YouTube channel. My name is Rafael Grohmann, Assistant Professor of Media Studies at the University of Toronto. Hello, everyone. Say hello in the chat. And today we have an event co-organized by DigiLabour and Tierra, Comun, a powerful research network in order to celebrate and talk about the recently launched book called Predatory Data by Anita Say Chan. I will give the floor to Anita. We have two participants today. I will introduce you to Anita Chan, who just launched the book called Predatory Data, Eugenics in Big Tech and Our Fight for an Independent Future, published by the University of California Press. Anita Say Chan is a scholar and educator dedicated to feminist and decolonial approaches to technology. She's an associate professor of information science and media and founder of Community Data Clinic at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Hello, Anita. How are you?
Well, thanks. Good morning, everybody. Sorry for the late start.
Yeah, and we'll have here two powerful discussants in order they will engage with Anita's presentation. They are Paola Ricaurte is an associate professor at the Department of Media and Digital Culture at Tecnologico de Monterrey and a faculty associate at the Berkman Kleist Center. Hi, Paola. Great.
Hi.
And we have here Esteban is assistant professor in media and digital cultures at the University of Groningen in Netherlands. Hi, Esteban.
Hi, Rafael and everybody.
Great. Anita, the floor is yours. There are a lot of people here waiting for you. I can show like Tanner Miller from Canada, André Campos Rocha from Brazil saying hello, Ricardo Festi, congratulations, I'm Selling from Brazil, Juan Ortiz Frolde from Los Angeles and a heart in Buenos Aires, Daniel Santini, great initiative, and Ciale, hello from New York. Anita, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Rafael, and to the DigiLabour and Tierra Comun networks for the invitation to join you here today. This talk draws from my new book project on predatory data. And for it, I want to begin here with a proposition. What would it mean for us to narrate the origins of our contemporary data economy, not with the conventional knowledge centers and academic and industry vanguards that have dominated explanations of our present information age, but at another kind of temporal setting, that of the racialized datification fever that fed the rise of what was arguably the 20th century's first popular globally expansive information movement, when eugenic ambitions aimed to provide universal methods for predicting human fitness, and when eugenic researchers, anxiously facing globalization's modern advent and growing independence struggles around the world, seeded a cross-continental movement to monitor unfitness and remake societies in the image of white Western elites over a century ago. To suggest that we expand the means by which we locate the origins of our contemporary data economy around eugenics, violently segregationist disinformation age, is to not only decenter the dominant narrative of the technological present from its familiar cast of Western technological heroes, genius male disruptors, and enterprise-seeking rebels that have been popularly celebrated as daring visionaries of a new computational future. It is to give name to its explicitly race, gendered, class, and geopolitical predations that, even when largely unspoken, have laid long and deep at its very foundations. As I argue too in my newly released book, to recognize eugenics as a forerunner to contemporary forms of predatory data draws attention to how the targeted monitoring and surveillance of minoritized populations have not been merely incidental outcomes of data economies. They have been rather essential components of dispossessive and profit-generating knowledge regimes that demanded the continuous profiling of populations. Indeed, from their earliest efforts, eugenicists targeted minoritized populations to generate the excess of data that conditioned the rise of new global classes of information elites. Eugenic hierarchies, that is, grew by expanding global information architectures to monitor and assess human populations and to differentiate deserving classes from the physically, morally, and mentally unfit. This project underscores how eugenic researchers enthusiastically channeled their ambitions through the frenzied development of very new data methods and instruments for identifying and predicting degeneracy in the 19th and early 20th century. These included, as this talk will underscore, intelligence metrics and IQ exams to predict poverty and underproductivity, as much as future cognitive exceptionality. Far from assuming eugenics' disappearance from after World War II, this talk will proceed in three parts, tracing an arc from eugenics to what I argue as contemporary techno-eugenics, exploring how eugenic logics are inseparable from data-driven technologies behind today's information economy. Part one of this talk then revisits the history of eugenic intelligence prediction, unpacking how its use as an instrument for political stratification endures in knowledge economy frameworks promoted by techno elites today, underscoring how the spread of the eugenic information age had been diagnosed generations before. However, part two explores how eugenic research has long been contested by immigrant and feminist alliances around data, including ones that emerged in the late 19th century. And returning to the present, part three draws from that legacy of data pluralist methods that justice-based actors continue to cultivate globally today, suggesting strategies for countering AI's eugenic stratifications and mono-futurist agenda through a defense of what I'll stress as improbable worlds. So with that, let me begin with part one. Nearly a century after US eugenicists popularized IQ tests as a new metrics to empiricize intelligence and predict future value, a celebration of cognitive elites was being revived in new millennial discourse around the knowledge economy. Defined by a shift away from the manual labor of an earlier industrial age, the knowledge economy was framed in the mainstream press and academy of the 1990s as driven by a new class of intellectual workers who were heralded as engines behind a surge in technological innovation and wealth creation. Such framings, however, also relied on a revival of eugenic models of social hierarchy built around the supposed objectivity of intelligence prediction and the myth of the outsized merit and productivity of cognitive elites. These myths around merit and metrics help give rise to what I argue has been a new techno-eugenics driven by Silicon Valley elites who today wage campaigns against supposedly regressive democratic norms and the protection of inferior races. By wastefully undermining the superior productivity and revolutionary potential of cognitive elites, techno-eugenicists have alleged that democratic policies have produced nothing less than an existential threat to technology and the fate of the entire Western world around it. Nothing better exemplifies the eugenic revival at the dawn of the new millennium's digital age, I argue, than the controversial popularity of the 1994 publication, The Bell Curve, Intelligence and Class Structure in American Life. Selling some 400,000 copies in its first 2 months after publication, the text's overnight best-selling status sent its eugenic arguments into the headlines of nearly every major US news outlet, from the New York Times to Good Morning America and beyond. Written for a popular audience by longtime conservative and libertarian authors Richard Herrnstein, a Harvard University psychologist, and Charles Murray, a fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, the text infamously set off a pitched national debate by leveraging hundreds of pages of data to reassert a biological, racialized basis for intelligence, correlating individual achievement and socioeconomic success with hereditarily determined IQ measures. Across 800 pages, replete with tables, graphs, and data and IQ, The authors argued that the US's most pressing economic and social problems could be empirically traced to questions of intelligence and to problems of both overinvesting in populations with lower IQs through public education, for instance, and to nationally disinvesting in gifted populations. They stressed two rising demands for the skills of a cognitive elite, who they argued were best suited to meet the needs of more complex labor in the evolving information economy, where the, quote, manipulation of information would now be central. Broadly decrying welfare, education, and immigration policies that supported minorities and the poor and that drew resources away from the merit-certified elite, the authors asserted an empirical truth to inequality and accused US policy makers of creating a national disaster by trying to correct natural hierarchy through democratic policies. By their assertion, quote, inequality is a reality, and it is time for America once again to try living with inequality, end quote. The once again they referred to, of course, was a winking reference to the eugenic roots of their argument and to the powerful influence Western eugenic researchers once held over national policies and popular culture a century ago. The Pell Curve's introduction, thus, also framed in the text in light of the work of Sir Francis Galton, the British biostatistician credited with founding eugenics' global movement in the late 19th century. For decades, Galton worked to find an empirical basis in science of social hierarchy by creating a metrics of human physical, mental, and moral fitness. In contexts like the US, eugenics gained political prominence by growing research architectures and methods to informatically monitor and assess human populations and to differentiate worthy classes from the physically, morally, and mentally unfit. Eugenic researchers based everywhere from Harvard to Stanford and Galton's own University College London enthusiastically channeled their ambitions through the development of varied new data methods, population monitoring techniques, and instruments for predicting degeneracy from the late 19th century onward. This included biometric databases for criminals and immigrants, composite portraiture to predict behavior, morality, and genetic surveys of broadly defined dysgenic classes, and indeed IQ exams and literacy evaluations for immigrants and the poor. Their data work, amplified through US institutions like the Cold Spring Harbor-funded Eugenics Record Office and the American Eugenics Society and American Breeders Association, allowed their arguments to spread for the broad monitoring and the suspension of basic rights of supposedly genetically contaminating minority populations. Asserting that their proximity and the freedom of the unfit would threaten the survival of more worthy classes, their work would see to the popularization of the notion of racial suicide. And they saw, too, to the passage of historic acts in the US over a century ago, from immigrant exclusion laws to quotas to favor Nordic races, and to the eventual passage of laws to forcibly sterilize the so-called unfit that disproportionately impacted poor Black, brown, and indigenous women in over 30 states. It was their data-driven practices, I stress, that allowed eugenicists to be so successful in counteracting democratic norms and to arguing that their socially stratifying mission was fundamentally evaluative rather than political. Their normalization of predictive uses of IQ and intelligence tests to promote the segregation of the cognitive elite from so-called degrading populations, thus exemplified, as with other historic policy gains around immigration and sterilization, the efficacy of using data, however questionably derived, to reveal the so-called real truth of human inequality. US psychologist and eugenicist Henry Goddard, who first introduced the term moron in medical establishment to establish a multi-tiered classification for the feeble-minded, infamously popularized the use of intelligence testing in the US after translating early French tests into English in 1908. With fellow eugenicists, he strove to prove how intelligence as the primary indicator of deficient self-control, criminality, alcoholism, laziness, prostitution, and even political dissent would inevitably demand expensive state investments to address. He thus advocated intelligence testing for all US immigrants to exclude unfit arrivals, and would seed an intelligence testing industry in the US after distributing copies, more than 88,000 of them, of translated and self-designed tests to schools, immigration offices, and other public institutions. Among the questions, all to be administered in English, that he added to assess arriving immigrants were, what is Crisco, the US-made cooking product, and who is Christy Mathewson, a US football player? After deploying the test at Ellis Island, he argued that over 80% of non-Nordic immigrants were supposedly feeble-minded. The data he collected was credited to with the passage of the historic 1917 US Immigration Act, the first bill that introduced quotas for all immigrants, and that specifically aimed to prevent the entry of non-Nordic races to the US. More than half a century later, it was such segregationist gains in eugenic data that the Bell Curve's best-selling authors suggested a return to, and that they defended in their revival of a racialized hereditary intelligence model. Many pondered contemporarily how eugenic arguments had reemerged with such force in the 1990s, but Herrnstein and Murray were clear about the resonances they saw between their text and the heightened imperative of the new knowledge economy. As they wrote, highlighting the demands of the new skills of the cognitive elite, quote, today's technological frontier is more complex than ever, with labor less efficiently performed by non-cognitive elites, end quote. Moreover, they wrote that the link between IQ and productivity, quote, goes deep. A smarter employee is on average a more productive employee, end quote. And they lamented US laws forbidding of intelligence-based hierarchy, recommending that, quote, an economy that lets employers pick applicants with the highest IQ is significantly more efficient, end quote. While a pitched debate ensued across mainstream and scholarly circles, absent from the dissent were leading academic voices related to knowledge economy frameworks, and the tech sector actors themselves, who were celebrated as emblematic of cognitive elites. Their silence on the matter seemed to channel an endorsement of the distinction they were given and the basis in merit and objective intelligence it was argued to rely upon across Silicon Valley. Instead, vocal advocates such as venture capitalist Peter Thiel, the libertarian and billionaire co-founder of PayPal and Palantir Technologies, argued that there were heightened stakes to empowering cognitive elites in the new economy, stressing the existential imperatives of the innovation of industry innovation that they drove. Channeling techno-eugenic anxieties too, Thiel further fanned contempt for democracy and welfare states. By 2009, he began to publicly speak out and publish on the threat of government regulations and anti-discrimination policies as wastefully supporting regressed populations and blocking industry innovations that would lead to economic degeneration. Asserting his realization that democracy and freedom are no longer compatible, he'd write that technology and politics are instead, quote, in a deadly race, where the fate of our world now depends on the effort of a single person who builds the machinery of freedom to make the world safer for capitalism, end quote. Thiel, of course, by 2016, was funding US MAGA candidates Donald Trump to the loud applause of the Republican National Convention attendees. And he's also credited with first seeding Silicon Valley's infamous move fast and break things ideology that insists that technological progress should be pursued relentlessly with little, if any, regard for potential costs or dangers to society. Notably, too, despite Thiel's clear techno-eugenic overtones, his obsession with empowering a cognitive elite has earned him countless devotees in Silicon Valley and around the world. The depth of his influence can be seen in his enduring role as a mentor and leader in Silicon Valley's so-called PayPal mafia, an exclusive network of elite tech engineers and capitalists that includes Elon Musk, and the founders and investors of YouTube, Yelp, LinkedIn, Facebook, Airbnb, Lyft, Spotify, and Google's DeepMind, among others. Such continuing recruitments can make techno-eugenic expressions and expansions throughout the data economy sound unstoppable. But I would be remiss to not mention that alternative data strategies have long been cultivated in distinction to eugenic research methods, including by social justice actors from over a century ago. And so for the second part of this talk, I take inspiration from the data work of past generations of feminist and immigrant organizers whose work recall for us the long histories of intersectional feminist and collaborative data practice, ones with roots in spaces beyond the tech industry corridors and startups who get the most attention. More than 100 years ago, feminist data researchers were posing critical questions around gender, power, and data practice, and challenging the standard epistemological infrastructures by which knowledge and data on marginalized communities in particular was fostered, so that distinct infrastructures could emerge otherwise. The famed Hull House Project, located in Chicago's multi-ethnic West Side, was founded, for instance, by feminist advocates Jane Addams and Ellen Gates Starr in 1889 as one such effort. Many might recall its leading role in the US settlement house movement, which by 1910 had grown to over 400 sites that addressed the growing exploitations of urban labor and housing. Hull House came too to be known for its unique success in advancing such key legal reforms in the US as the 8-hour workday, minimum wage laws, and outlawing child labor. But it was also a hub for prototyping various approaches to social science and community research that championed a new ethical paradigm emphasizing social justice and that countered dominant ideas of the era that saw poverty as a result of individual failing and eugenically determined racialized heredity. Part of Hull House's success involved its design that blended a community center with an educational campus in Chicago's West Side, where local families, largely immigrants and ethnic minorities, could access classrooms and libraries for free courses, kindergarten and daycare, theater and art studios, gyms and athletic programs, as well as a coffee house and meeting rooms that all remained open to the working families and publics of Chicago's 19th Ward. But Hull House's success also had to do with the novel approaches to research undertaken by residents there to document local labor conditions. The Hull House Maps and Paper volume, published in 1895, was an exemplar that quickly placed it at the forefront of new data collection and output techniques, and that would later establish fields from urban sociology to social work. Composed of essays by 10 authors, 8 of which were women, and 3 of whom identified as US immigrants, and only 2 who had university training in social sciences, the Hull House Maps and Papers volume opened with a modest preface by Jane Addams, who cited the color-coded wage maps of London published by Charles Booth in 1886 as an inspiration. But Hull House's Maps and Papers also featured the use of pluralistic data, incorporating surveys and statistics alongside qualitative data and direct testimony from the 19th Ward that residents, all direct testimony from 19th Ward residents, all this to newly capture how gender, ethnicity, and age impacted the lives of working residents and families. Modeling how such added context could powerfully impact research and visualization work, the Maps and Papers volume prompted many later surveys in the 19th Ward, including those that leading sociology departments, such as the University of Chicago's, would come famously to be known for. Chapters on Chicago's sweating system, wage-earning children, and cloak-makers' expenditures joined others on Czech and Italian community life and on the settlement's impact on the labor movement. Details on the daily conditions of life, from the lack of air light and space in tenements, to the complex rotations of work and sleep that families maintain for labor, were paired with empirical, but until then largely unseen and invisible data on the economic system of Chicago's sweatshops, the varying wages, for instance, of stitching hems, the premature aging of workers, and the deformities and diseases contracted by working children. The color-coded wage maps of the volume that were paired with essays further put Hull House's multi-method approaches on display. Co-produced by Alice Holbrook, a student of math and visual arts, and Frances Kelly, a single mother of 3 who was working for the Illinois Bureau of Labor Statistics when she resided at Hull House, the maps testified not just to the potential of blending statistical with visual techniques, but to their potentials for challenging and disrupting dominant gender and class-based definitions and classifications to readers. Holbrook and Kelly mark their use of households, for instance, as the measuring unit for income in their wage maps to underscore the essential contributions of women and children to family income. They specified that while readers might find it unusual to see the household category applied to single wage earners, generally assumed to be men, and the category of the family head, again assumed to generally be a father with dependents, Holbrook explained, quote, in this neighborhood, generally a wife and children are sources of income too. The women wash, do home finishing on clothing. The boys run errands and shine, and the girls work in factories or sell papers on streets, end quote. Thus, they argued, the standard practice of treating wives and children as dependents negated their economic contributions. As the authors wrote, quote, the theory that every man supports his own family is as idle as the fiction that everyone can get work if he wants it, end quote. Hull House's surveys are relevant reminders, too, of the longer legacy of pluralistic research practices that engage the energies of amateurs as well as professional social scientists and devoted as much energy to formatting data for experts as for local organizing. By 1895, Hull House and local neighbors were organizing college extension courses that drew hundreds of students, largely young women and neighbors, to classes. It hosted, too, a students' association, several clubs for trade unions and labor organizers, including the Binary Girls Union and the Men's Typographical Union, both founded at the Hull House. As well as an 8-hour club dedicated to the passage of the Factory and Workshop Bill, a 19th Ward Improvement Club that met with Illinois legislature members, and a Working People's Social Science Club that hosted prominent international activists and researchers for what organizers simply called, quote, a neighborhood forum for social and economic topics. Such pluralistic data infrastructures made Hull House a generative space for future leaders, with many alum going on to serve leading roles in diverse history-making organizations, from the NAACP to Legal Aid, the National Consumers League, the Women's Trade Union League, the National Committee on Child Labor, and the Progressive Party in the US. Its project, I'd argue, too, is a reminder of the legacy of undercredited knowledge work that marginalized populations continue to undertake, often outside of the academy, to pluralize research trajectories today. Especially in contemporary Latin America, such work has operated to not only better account for the diverse experiences of lived vulnerability, but to demonstrate how alternative knowledge practices can effectively reset public understandings on such issues as a broad experience of gender-based violence. Efforts surrounding the historic Nuno Menace movement have thus been credited with not only amassing some of the largest protests across Latin America, with marches of tens of thousands brought together across diverse ethnic backgrounds, classes, generations, and political affiliations, but they've been credited too with some of the largest regional data sets on gender-based violence, gathering participants' feedback on a topic notoriously shrouded in silence. In Argentina, such data work emerged through a diverse coalition of feminist organizations who volunteered their labor to design a survey on the topic. The over 60,000 responses that were received in the Argentinian survey revealed how expansive the experience of gender-based violence was, with over 97% of respondents reporting that they had suffered some version of it, and more than 20% reporting rape, while only 5% said that they had reported anything to the police. Far from affirming any singular monolithic category of gender-based violence, too, organizers stress how their findings urge the need to pluralize conventional understandings that had been primarily framed around the experience of women in heteronormative relationships. Alongside the trauma of domestic violence organizers documented then, they stressed respondents' feedback on the violence stemming from discriminatory policies LGBTQ people faced, that from the criminalization of migration or from abortion bans and the lack of access to free healthcare. Channeling a pluralist feminist orientation, Nuno Menes's work to broaden and reset knowledge around the variable vulnerabilities of gendered lives animates what the decolonial Argentine philosopher Maria Lugones described as a coalitional consciousness. Such an ethic expands modes of relationality between diverse colonized peoples and importantly enables new modes of connection to be fostered between them beyond the terms standardized by dominant colonial knowledge regimes. In the age of big data, decolonial feminist work around data pluralisms also notably serves another function. From Hull House to Nuno Menos, their commitments have insisted on alternatives to predatory data infrastructures that have broadly instrumentalized and profited from a reification of dominant knowledge regimes that segment oppressed peoples into discrete categories of gender, race, and class. By decolonial feminist accounts, such divisions not only fail to account for the complex intersectionality threaded throughout oppressed people's lives, they also reify colonial hierarchies and heteronormative worldviews while diffusing other potentials for solidarity making. Consistently, then, decolonial feminist efforts have operated to decenter what we might have presumed have already been settled as given knowns around gender-based dynamics in the real world, particularly in one increasingly defined by big data, where the measure of difference has been used to stabilize and automate gendered and racialized social hierarchies. And so for this final section, I want to explore how decolonial feminists push back on the predatory forms of datification and prediction amplified by AI systems today, and also how feminist pushback has been done not just through a commitment to data pluralism, but through a defense of what I'll call here improbable worlds. I underscore improbability in this final section to contrast with statistically determined forms of likelihood and calculation for probable majority-based outcomes used by AI systems today. Such majority-seeking approaches are commonly used to predict probable outcomes through data processed for the largest possible set of users on platforms, sorting the fullness of activity in the world into predetermined categories in order to achieve scale. Such operations work too to keep users blind to other improbabilities, separating populations into a hierarchy of discretely valued classes and classifications, the very work that drove eugenic ambitions across generations. I highlight improbability then to stress statistically minority contexts and conditions that in their existence defy probability and the metrics of scale. Drawing support from unpredictable resources or surprising allies, improbable outcomes can often thrive in the face of dominant systems. And whether in the emergence of unlikely outcomes, such as the emergence of a planet Earth in a universe largely hostile to life, or the thriving of minority communities when dominant forces might condition assimilation, improbable worlds signal the vibrant heterogeneity of being and open possibility across time. This has been harder to notice, however, in a world increasingly defined by AI prediction systems and their amplified projection of probable futures. The prolific real-time recommendations that are channeled through routine interactions for everything from digital identification systems to hiring software, security and navigation technologies, to social media and large language models deliver their predictions and shape a reality intended for the largest volume of processes. In doing so, they activate probable world solutions that bias towards the dominant views and majoritarian outcomes that can be statistically extracted from a data set. And while such systems can provide users with recommendations that appear to be the safest bet, there are many scenarios in which generating probable outcomes for projected futures empirically fails, or have led indeed to a range of deadly injustices. This was the case, for instance, when the AI system Compass, used by US judges to determine jail sentencing, was found, of course, to wrongly overpredict Black individuals and underpredict white individual likelihood to repeat committing future crimes. This has been the case too when students with visual impairments at the University of Illinois, my own campus, were found to be consistently overflagged as cheating by facial recognition and online proctoring platforms like Proctorio. There are other scenarios too where the desired future is explicitly not the probable outcome. This is true not only in cases of predicting the likely reality for minoritized populations, where data sets are too limited or misrepresentative to accurately project future outcomes, but this is also the case in contexts that involve the protection of minoritized value systems, where racial justice or feminism, where majoritarian populations and values are overrepresented in existing data sets. While such errors are often dismissed by technologists as due to an over or underrepresentation of certain populations and data sets, they fail to acknowledge that when dealing with the fullness of real-world possibilities, as well as the entrenched liabilities of colonial archives and patriarchal datification that have never fully represented the past, there will always be misaligned data sets. Even when dealing with data sets that aren't mapping human lives, probability-based outcomes have been critiqued for reproducing majoritarian worldviews that extinguished other desired values. AI systems' probabilistic readings of user tastes in music, for instance, have led creative producers to critique how such systems have encouraged more formulaic approaches to composition that narrow artistic expression, as producers have nudged towards designing for taste at scale, and as varied other creative potentials get quietly truncated. Such increasingly narrow monoculturalist terms for legibility and existence within predictive AI platforms are among the pathologies publics now routinely grapple with as technological design is captured by the majoritarian probable world terms of techno-eugenics. This includes not just figures like Peter Thiel, but of course others like Elon Musk, who well before his unprecedented supercharging of authoritarian and white nationalist politics in the US and abroad, and of course last week's still unprompted Nazi salute and follow-up speeches before Germany's far-right AfD party, had already been making headlines years earlier for his increasing amplification of white supremacist post and eugenic conspiracy theories of race suicide and replacement theory, and for his predatory relationships with female employees, as well as his creepy pronatalist insistence to Silicon Valleyites that, quote, civilization will crumble if we, as in techno elites, don't have more babies. And so too have his reality-defying outcries of persecution and harm for minorities and anti-discrimination groups, which has led him to threaten lawsuits against nonprofits like the Anti-Defamation League for lost revenue and allegedly seeking to destroy Twitter. Likewise, accelerationist movement figures like venture capitalist Mark Andreessen and OpenAI's Sam Altman have garnered attention for large pro-AI fests in Silicon Valley, thrown to defend AI against socialist enemies whose accelerationists call to defend what AI, what they call socialist enemies, and what accelerationists call deranged regulations that threaten to stagnate a techno-capitalist future and slow the rise of AI's supreme intelligence. Too often, such figures have been treated in mainstream discourse as no more than eccentric tech geniuses who, with excusably naive or juvenile antics, or more recently, following Silicon Valley's visible alignment behind the new Trump administration, they've been framed too as no more than cynically profit motive businessmen. But such frames have failed to take seriously how such actors dangerously depend on the spread of probable majoritarian values and the active empowerment of dominant classes for AI's growth. Through biasing towards probable outcomes, their prediction systems have provided a means to actively amplify majoritarian worldviews into the future, allowing the overblown anxieties of majoritarian populations, nationalists, and the far right across the globe to go from fringe to front page overnight. Their forceful denial of charges of racism and indignant defense of their work as invested in either freeing speech or, quote, saving civilization, only allow them to deflect accountability for their harms. Moreover, their insistences on the need for continual technological revolution powerfully work to drown out other alternative paths for future worlding, so much so that to refuse their future virtually means refusing the future itself. The absurdity of such projections, however, can and should be named as a core symptom of techno-eugenics and its effort to colonize perceptions of reality through fear-mongering. Their repeated claims of persecution by Silicon Valley's most wealthy elites should readily indicate how deeply a pathological drive for self-preservation propel white male techno-elites' claims around insecurity. While tempting to dismiss, it would be a mistake to not take seriously their effect from detracting away from the actual vulnerabilities that have amplified for other parties all around the world. Being forced, that is, to focus on techno-eugenicists' survival, that is, means paying less attention to the narrowing terms for survival and support that they've created for everyone else. Little wonder that growing publics have called for resistance to such systems and to their foreclosing of possibilities for another independent and unprescribed future. Such refusals remind us that accepting Silicon Valley's techno-eugenic terms is far from inevitable. Actively refusing its probable majoritarian predictions as the most evolved future, however, does mean something other than quitting platforms. It means renewing feminist and decolonial commitments to other vital futures and defending data pluralism and support for not only diverse systems of knowing beyond techno-eugenic terms, but recognizing the deep damage done when reality and history are framed by the masculinist paradigms of competitive survival, natural hierarchy, and global scarcity. Such frames work to foreclose alternative futures, keeping publics frozen in the precarity of self-preservation. Rejecting techno-eugenic frames thus opens possibilities for registering the present and future on new terms. Rather than projecting the wholesale rejection of technology as the only alternative, it engages accounts that underscore the persistent possibility of and deep longing for solidarity and collective vitalities around data pluralism and technological alternatives that have never been fully captured by techno-eugenics' monoculturalist agenda. Calling out the false conceit of technological revolution and now big data and AI's projected universalism, feminist data pluralists take seriously not only the violence enacted in attempting to deny the full diversity of futures possible through probable world rejections, they also remind us of the situated nature of alternative justice-oriented data practices and the varied improbable worlds they support. They remind us that seeing data from below and grounded in varied local contexts and rejecting what Donna Haraway called the God's eye view from nowhere is a necessary ethical stance. It may indeed be our best bet for enabling not just feminist relations of accountability and collaborative being, but also our best means to diffuse techno-eugenic expansions of majoritarian probability and monocultural survival. To respond to the very temporal orientations of marginalized community as feminists and decolonial researchers do, renews commitments to not merely know, but to stay, be, and think with such communities in what STS scholars have called the tempos of care time. Decolonial feminist researchers' defense of improbable worlds that situates data practice in a temporal order that unfolds outside that of big data's insistence on universality. From such a vantage, datification processes can be read as something other than an abstracted process whose global takeover and grip on the future is already a given. It can be recognized instead as an uneven and locally contingent process that gets differentially shaped across locales by specific forms of resistance and care. From such a vantage, big tech companies and institutions driving AI regimes can now be seen not as decontextualized global forces, but as entities for which stability relies on the sustained coordination across local sites, where local forms of disruption and dissent can still meaningfully register. This project has issued a call then to listen and remember and recall the strategies fostered across generations around feminist data pluralisms and its multi-temporal relationalities, and to resist techno-eugenics' false insistence on revolutionary imperatives and its percussive singular drive for control and profit as supposedly the highest aim of technology and data work, and the only path to future making. This is a call to foster closer recognition of the interconnective cultivations data pluralists brought forth across generations. Such critical orientations center the experiences, perspectives, and storytelling of marginalized populations, and in doing so advance new frameworks in defense of improbable worlds. These include calls for the abolishment of big data and sovereignty, and data sovereignty, as well as counter data and data defense and data bodies defense, anti-spying and collective benefit as forms of situated data practice. These local data encounters that such projects entail then recognize the need for fostering varied modes of seeing to challenge unlocatable and unaccountable modes of knowledge practice. They also reveal the inherent multiplicity of potentials for interpretation that surrounds any data set that users are often encouraged to see as given and predetermined by probability. Their commitments to improbable worlds remind us that dislodging our contemporary imaginaries around data and AI-driven economies, and for their singular focus on privileged sites of high innovation, is long overdue. Such fixations have artificially kept public's focus on operations taking place inside the exclusive sites of Silicon Valley firms and research campuses. The outsized attention given to the exceptionality and speed and scale that publics have repeatedly been told that such sites process have framed them as the digital age's highest achievement, and they have only reified probable world castings around big data and AI. In doing so, they draw attention away from the invisibilized work of repair and restoration necessary to contend with the global ecologies of exclusion and predation that big tech firms have accelerated. We need to reject such distractions and empower new imaginaries and freedom dreams, including around improbable worlds, around global technologies and societies that are not driven by the survivalist fantasies and paranoid self-preservationist anxieties of white Western techno elites. The call here then to think across time and space reminds us how much such work has already been and continues to be committed to reclaim the aims of pluralistic solidarity, restoration, and repair that diverse marginalized communities have cultivated in data work around the world. Such forms of global knowledge futures, too, have long been imagined. How to see ourselves in relation to them and these center technologies' deadly master narrative in the name of new solidarities is a challenge of improbable world building we're invited to step into. So thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Anita, for your amazing talk. Let me just remove the Yes. I'd like to take the chance to show you that I have the book, Predatory Data. Please read it. I'd like, before to pass the ball to Paola and Esteban, to read a brief passage, one of my preferred phrases in this book. In the page 204, is this book is a reminder of the vast ecologies of multivalent, multi-temporalized forms of data work, practice, and studies that resist the mono-futurist projections of AI and big data's temporalities through explicitly data pluralist practices in defense of improbable worlds. So thank you and congrats for your amazing book, Anita. Now we'll start the conversation with Paola and Esteban, and I will ask the people from the audience to ask your questions as well in English, Spanish, Portuguese, or whatever language you want to talk to us. So I'll pass the ball to Paola. Hello again, Paola.
Hello again. Thank you for inviting me, and especially thank you and congratulations, Anita, for this amazing book. I really think that we need a lot of historical analysis to understand the current moment, and also to uncover the narratives, practices, and values behind our current data regime. So I would like to first to bring back your provocation about what would mean to narrate the origins of our contemporary data economy, not with the conventional knowledge centers, academic vanguards, and industry settings that have dominated explanation of the advance of our present information age, but with another kind of temporal settings. Because I think that you really are doing a great job to make us think of the importance to analyze the narratives, but also what are the ideologies and the values that are behind the type of society that we have today. So I think that it's very clear from your study, from your analysis, that this ideology, this underlying ideology of these elites, historical elites, are associated with a clear idea of society, the society they want, and also the people they want. So the society, as you mentioned, is related to this idea of optimization, productivity, the monoculture, everything being homogeneous. And the people they want is smart people, whatever do they understand by like intelligent people, masculine, and as you mentioned, like with specific physical and mental characteristics. So one phrase that really struck me from the cover of your book is that some people are born to be a burden on the rest. And for me, this phrase really summarizes the whole idea of how far this ideology can go. Unfortunately, this ideology being the dominant ideology today in our current society. But on the other side, it makes me think that the question that you bring for the discussion is also that we need to understand knowledge, what institutions, what data, technology are needed to build that society that will foster certain humans and will erase other humans. So we have a society that is desirable with these humans that are desirable, and then they are going to build, these elites are going to build all what they need to make sure that they get rid of those that they consider a burden on the rest. So I would like to ask you, like, thinking about these issues, like for today, how this underlying ideology relates to the way we understand and think about technology, because you were mentioning at the beginning that maybe this understanding of technology that we have is very limited to understand the role technology plays, and also, I mean, to build this society. And also, this idea of technology that we have often fails to capture the full scope of the things that you have been speaking throughout the presentation, and of course throughout the book. So I would like you to speak a little bit more about that.
Thanks, Paula. So lovely question. Rafael, I can respond now. Is that right? We're in dialogue now, correct? Great, wonderful.
Yeah.
Thanks, Paula, for that question. I mean, the book is really trying to kind of lean into this arc around the relationship of technology and politics, and especially sort of knowledge and data elite, and their kind of long, long-standing, I mean, literally over a century old sort of obsession with trying to gain political power. Too much in sort of the mainstream news today. We've been looking at the sort of, I mean, what you'll see when people were leading up to the latest U.S. election, when journalists, even prominent liberal news outlets, or supposedly left of center outlets, from the New York Times, et cetera, we're sort of looking at the kind of rightward turn of Silicon Valley as if it were a new thing around these kinds of economic calculation of life, and the way that exactly their work had essentially, in the architectures they were building out, had already enacted a logic around some populations as being born to be as a burden on the others, that already all of their platforms were exhibiting. I mean, for years. Facebook is being sort of one example that I open the book with, and the kind of death machine it had really become, that Facebook was already the favorite tool of authoritarian governments well before 2016. Global nonprofit and human rights and on the ground organizers in the global South in particular were calling out Facebook for greater accountability. We're already documenting and doing research essentially on the scale of the impact on minoritized populations in various contexts across the global South, were essentially forms of ethnic cleansing and genocide, again, at scale. There was nothing secret about it at all, was being openly amplified on the platform without any kind of, without any sort of intervention. It wasn't a question, there wasn't already, by 2010, 2014 for sure, it wasn't a question of what will happen, to our platform, to Facebook, to social media and online communication if we take away moderation, or if we reduce moderation to the point where there's almost nothing happening there's no version of moderation happening on platform. We could already see, again, at scale, being reported by any number of different global workers and human rights agents, that we could already see ethnic cleansing and genocide. It's just that Facebook was very happy as a company to keep U.S. publics away from that sort of very open secret. And again, this kind of logic that was being exercised on the platform, not just Facebook, but Facebook became the sort of prominent example across different human rights spectrum, because it was so clearly obvious and had such a large stake in terms of online communication, but that essentially it was already making a calculus for which populations were worthy of protection, where they were going to invest in security, and whose protection was simply too expensive for them to care about, where their bottom line mattered much more. And we can now sort of, again, see this all over again in new calls around Facebook to sort of say, we're going to lean into supposedly free speech and just see what happens when we take away online moderation to the Western US, et cetera, Western Europe versions of Facebook. We already know what's going to happen. It knew what was happening years and years ago, and it is completely a kind of a lovely cover, and them leaning into their sort of own like liberal heroic gauge, and very conveniently utilizing this notion that Silicon Valley had a sudden rightward turn. There was no sudden rightward turn. It's been leaning rightward. It's been rightward and quite invested in a kind of eugenic logic for a very long time. And it's not that figures like Elon Musk or Peter Thiel or Mark Andreessen are just sort of eccentric outliers. They are by no means. I mean, we could already see, obviously, what was going on with the inauguration and this sort of like portrait of all of Silicon Valley just lined up behind Sundar Pichai and heads of all of the social media platforms, including supposedly ones that were more liberal leaning. They were very, very happy to essentially sort of, again, lean into a version of their own kind of self-protection, rather than sort of, again, underscoring the kind of necessity and their obligation in a lot of ways to really instead steward a kind of version of public safety or public and public health. It's amazing that also that oftentimes there's a sort of notion that, of course, these guys are doing what they're doing. They're just interested in their bottom line and their profit. This is not just a kind of interest in capitalism. And I think that's partly what the book is also underscoring, that we can say that there is maybe some portion of them that will kind of use that simply as cover. It's just a good business decision. Me being at the inauguration is nothing more, quote unquote, nothing more than a good business decision. But we can obviously see with folks like Peter Thiel and Elon Musk that this is an investment. This is about a political future and a kind of social re-engineering that's exhibited, and their will for that is exhibited not only in their leaning into an insistence that we create an internet that has essentially become, and social media platforms and online platforms, that has essentially become the largest social experimentation engine on world and global publics, that they would want and are arguing for essentially unchecked agency to be able to experiment on publics at scale as they do, without any kind of oversight, and that it's anathema and an outrage that anyone would call for their oversight. But that this is also not just about a business decision. Musk's investment in Twitter, which is still a questionable business investment, it's very politically profitable. There is no question that it has been enormously politically consequential, and that it is being used over and over again as a kind of, again, means to intervene in various global and national elections and conversations, again, experimenting with publics at scale, and very willingly doing so. It's still questionable whether or not, when it will become a kind of profitable enterprise as a financial engine, but no question that it's become very politically profitable for them. And again, they're willing to invest really billions into sort of this kind of remaking of societies at scale, of political leadership, again, at scale, and very much doing so as ideological, not just a kind of, gross capitalism, or this is sort of just leaning into some version of greed. And the problem is it's becoming increasingly normalized. I mean, yeah, amongst other things.
Great, thank you, Anita. Paola, do you have any follow-up question?
Well, I just think that what Anita helped us to do is to avoid being naive about technology, and and to think about. That's why I prefer not to speak only like to have this terminology like technology or data. I prefer to speak about these assemblages, right? Because they are composed of knowledge, institutions, the markets as well,
Yeah,
but politics,
nice.
ideologies. Like we don't have to, like we have to make sure that we connect all the dots, because otherwise we think that these are like casualties, that this happens because, I don't know, these people are crazy, and they are not crazy at all. This is a system that works like towards this end, to build this ideology and to produce these humans, and
Absolutely.
to get rid of the rest. So
Absolutely.
we don't have to be naive about that, right?
Absolutely.
Thank you, Anita. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you, Paola.
And with the book, for me, the temporality or the historical approach is really helpful, because sometimes people think that, oh, things are happening only now, or and this is really good. This also, I remember that 4 of us are members of Tierra Comun, a research network. I will put the website of Tierra Comun here. And Anita also quoted Paola and also Esteban in her book. Now I'll pass the ball to Esteban to your comments and questions.
Rafael, and thank you, Anita. That was wonderful presentation, and I really enjoyed the book. And I'm really happy I follow up Paola's question. 'Cause I really appreciated how you started the presentation by telling us that this is an exercise to center a particular story, a way of understanding the our current moment of datafication and AI through the lenses of eugenics. But as you well showed throughout your story, this story is not one story. But rather, it shows all the parts of story of patriarchy, short parts of story of the colonialism, of capitalism, and so forth. So here's where I stumble a little bit, where I'm paralyzed a little bit by the overwhelming force of this. And it is because when we're tasked then to reimagine, to create alternative, pluralistic solidarities, imaginaries, and infrastructure, we are not just doing so concerning AI or data. As Paola just said, it's about assemblages. So we not only have to address technology, we not only have to address data, but we have to address the datafication of banking, of identity, of connecting with others, of being Latin American. So eugenics through data has expanded through all these domains. So I think my question is just very simply, how do we start to negotiate all these tensions, all the spread, all the assemblages? Where do we start?
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you, Esteban. I would say that, all of us are working in different sort of locations and in different scales. And I would say that, and I hope the talk sort of leaned into this, that variations of the local are places where assemblages do articulate. Assemblages aren't just these sort of abstract things that operate at the level of the global, and that none of us sort of, all of us can only constitute ourselves as sort of abstracted users, and therein, have some version of user agency, but nothing other than that, as if assemblages are sort of just thrust upon us. Assemblages are things that articulate, and exactly at the kind of these sorts of infrastructures that are layered, in order to kind of make this version of it, whether it's a eugenic assemblage or a kind of global, a global capitalist infrastructure, all of them, in order to work, have to keep all the cogs sort of moving all the way down to the local. And there are still points, very concretely, and various local infrastructures that are able to still, where we're still able to both invest in other versions of future making that are at place. These aren't things that have to be invented, but also places where, for a very long time, social justice actors have been up to the work of exactly trying to demonstrate how there are these local assemblages that they are working to build alternatives to and build alternatives with, as both knowledge practitioners, data practitioners, as research investments, and as alternative workings, again, to try and create a different place for and a means for having conversations. I'll give 2 examples. I mean, one at the level of sort of official local politics, and then another version, which again sort of underscores another version of local assemblage, which I imagine that many people in this conversation space would be invested in, which is to think through our own campuses as also assemblages and practices, also experiments and infrastructures for future making, exactly because that's what we do at university campuses. That's the conceit of them, right? That as knowledge and research infrastructures, they are reproducing a version of not just future research, but literally human bodies that go on as either information professionals or research professionals, et cetera, in their own daily lives to enact those futures in those spectra. So on one level, okay, I'll start with the kind of local politics part of things. I'll give an example of what's going on in my own local community, because I know that various things are also going on across a range of different communities. Again, in the face and in the immediacy of what's going on with the new political administration here in the US, any number of local communities have been forced and prompted to sort of think through what do surveillance architectures and practices, policies look like in our own local spaces. What can we do to be protective? And a number of different communities, already this had been starting for a while, but I think it's been reinvigorated, especially with the kind of urgency of the new administrative turn and shift that happened this month. But a number of local communities have enacted or started to look into instituting new regulations and bills to create more public oversight over municipal level and local level acquisition of new surveillance technologies, such that there would be required to have some version of public approval, city council approval, local body approval, to at least create some transparency, some level of due process before new surveillance technologies, whether it's drones, automated license plate readers, facial recognition technologies, you name it, from law enforcement to other auspices in local government, that there's at least some process of public discussion and transparency. It's not a full stop ban on these things, but it is a first order requirement, again, for some version of public debate and transparency to enable that to happen. So my community has revived a bill, has introduced a bill in local government, and it's now under current debate, and we'll go into vote for city council, and we will see, we hope, we'll have our fingers crossed. And again, I think this is happening in community after community. On campuses as well, I mean, again, this did not happen overnight. There is perhaps an urgency right now because, again, of how much prominence and new activity exactly on this kind of amplification of techno-eugenics and a eugenic kind of surveillance, monitoring, and grab for infrastructures to control populations now that's happened. But there's been quite a bit of work from various sorts of networks and pockets of researchers, including DigiLabour and including Comun, to again rethink and reinvest in what is another version of data science that is not just sort of feeding this beast of not just a profit making, but really a regenic experimentation and re-engineering of society and social publics. Right, that is what we do when we channel them into engines like Silicon Valley, under-equipped to be able to really participate in versions of conversation. Either a version of this kind of conversation and network, where it's really like, who else is having this kind of means to actually an alternative to build an alternative to what this version of future making is here in this professional in Silicon Valley companies, reinvesting in a way in modes of alternative infrastructure building, but also allowing them and empowering them with different kinds of tools, exactly the kinds of conversations and the kinds of means for sort of future imagining and community and future making that, again, I think networks like Comun and DigiLabour are invested in, and that it begins with really sort of freeing the imagination rather than sort of collapsing everything into this sort of mono-futurist mode of it has to be this way. There have been historical precedences of being able to upset and overturn Darwinist, capitalistic, and eugenic paradigms for knowledge making that have happened before. And certainly there is opportunity to still do it. But it is up to us to be able to make those calls and to be able to empower local networks that can scale in order to do so.
Thanks, Anita. I will jump in quickly here just to say I really like your approach on imagination and not like overlooking community as an homogeneous an issue, and also the way you talked about the importance of the language as well, or the reframe, and not only saying, as I researched like cooperatives, it's not only about talking about AI and cooperatives. We have to reframe all the methods and epistemologies behind of it. And I think some manifestos published in the recent years were important as well. One of them, you were a co-author, the Feminist Data Manifesto. There is the Decolonial AI Manifesto. There is a Digital Pluriverse Manifesto. So a manifesto is a kind of language as well. Some Tierra Comun's members like Ranjit Singh and Ricaurte Guzman published parables of AI, and a kind of powerful way, in order to try to reframe that. Esteban, do you have any more questions or follow-up questions?
No, I think it's more of a thank you. I really appreciate. Sometimes the force of this assemblages feels too much, but at the end, it's feeling like this epistemological closure. But when you bring back all these histories of resistance as well, solidarity, it's also a good way to remind ourselves that there are alternative ways of thinking about this. There have been stories of resistance that have been successful. So that there are also assemblages on the other side to respond to it.
Absolutely. To be really clear, I mean, one of the, I think, brilliant things that this kind of space, Tierra Comun and DigiLabour, explicitly and intentionally lean into is exactly the technology of solidarity making. I mean, when we look at what the historical precedents, at least the ones that I'm raising, and there are any number of alternative ones that, again, we can attend back to, our attention spans and like the digital economy does not want us to remember any of these precedents, precisely because it sort of destabilizes their own sort of narrative of inevitability. But when we look at any of these examples of wins that were gained to remake what the sort of given paradigm was around poverty and the undeserving poor, et cetera, and immigrants and criminality, whatever those, again, any number of those sort of deeply eugenic frameworks that have to get remade over and over again, or re-encountered over and over again, because there's such pushes to remake them. But when we look at the precedents for what's enabled their overturning, it's always required some version of solidarity making, of alliance, and reimagining some version of counter politics at scale that bring conversations across class, across nationalities, across races, across these sorts of categories that if you allow them to sort of just remain undisturbed, want by nature to kind of divide populations. It brings to mind a really famous an article that's well known in the digital humanities circuits. Tara McPherson's "Why Are the Digital Humanities So White?" And part of her answer is exactly the same answer that Maria Lugones answers, which is a version of sort of intellectual apartheid. What we've done, what a contemporary liberal academy has done, or neoliberal academy, I suppose we could say, has done, is really segment actors and researchers and intellectuals that otherwise would be acting in some version of non-prescribed solidarity, as in not siloed into, one unit and another unit that are supposed to kind of maintain their student bodies and not, sometimes share resources, but by and large, just keep your lines to yourselves. Your academic lines and academic resources need to sort of be protected, et cetera. And everyone needs to be in this work of sort of self-preservation, as opposed to, again, thinking about how can resources blend? How is this sort of logic sort of, again, just keeping us all siloed into these distinct, supposedly distinct categories, supposedly work in our interests, as opposed to what would happen if we really sort of collapsed them and started to think across other sorts of modes of political remaking. So in any case, thank you for that question.
Excellent. We have some questions from the audience. Right now, I would like only to share the hellos. Stuart Levy, hello from Stuart from Champaign. Ulysses Mejias is here. Ola, congrats on the book, Anita. Yusuf Hassan, sending hello from Toronto. Senoritas Courier, hello from São Paulo, Brazil, is the Libre Worker Co-op. Jill Ducey, Ushnish Sengupta said, is interested in many of the schools workshops where art-centered places.
Exactly.
Lucio Mello will say congrats to DigiLabour. And there's one question by Daniel Santini. Daniel Santini is a coordinator of Rosa Luxemburg Stiftung in São Paulo. Anita, are there translated versions of the book you think it would make sense to translate it to Portuguese focused at the Brazilian audience?
I'd love it. my conversations with UCP, with my publisher, I will say they've been a really, really lovely publisher to work with. They have a specific stream of social justice funds, especially for new, first generation and underrepresented authors and scholars. And I think it's one of the benefits of working with a nonprofit press. So yes, one of those. Thank you for that prompt, and absolutely.
Excellent. There's one question by André Campos Rocha. André was a visiting PhD student here in Toronto, and he finished his PhD in Brazil. Do you have any comments on data colonialism in a geopolitical perspective? Whoa, like 2 years to talk about it. Just thinking of a Chinese generated AI app, DeepSeek, and how it's confronting U.S. big tech's dominancy.
Yeah. I mean, obvious. Yeah. I mean, should I respond to that? Can I respond to that? Just because I mean, it was some. I actually saw that as real good, very, very good news. Just again to sort of blow the cover on again, like exactly what this kind of version of like mono-futurist imperative and collapsing of the imagination does. It's not just something that ends up impacting everyday publics. It's literally something that impacts large investors, and this capture that this small coterie of I mean, again, I call them techno-eugenicists, but like the kind of specialized leaders, the hyper elite of Silicon Valley, and now this sort of AI economy have been given, means that they sort of suck up every version of potential future making, even around their own technologies and their own industry, such that you don't even pay attention to all the other dynamics that may be coming around the edges. And when they can't come up with a prescription, like let's recreate our entire sort of resource infrastructure and the way that we fund not just sort of vulnerable populations, but the way that we fund and sustain different industries, such that whole energy economy would be used and remade to channel and to support an AI infrastructure according to the model that OpenAI had insisted upon, which was on these sort of grossly exorbitant sort of chipset scale, and data centers now expanded exponentially. I mean, just imagine what kind of devastating impact that would have on ecologies, and also what it means to upset different sort of other economic infrastructures. The cover was completely blown on that. Just what was it, 2 days ago? I can't remember. But in any case, again, it's that it didn't need to have been a blown cover. It was just that OpenAI had really like sucked out everything out of all the other conversation out of the room, such that it was almost impossible to see outside of their own wing channel. So in any case, it's a healthy check. We need many, many more, and it shouldn't just happen at this sort of level of high energy, high stakes infrastructures. It happens even around the kind of everyday infrastructures of education, knowledge making that we are all part of and sustain.
Great. Thank you so much, Anita. Thank you, Paola. Thank you, Esteban. Thank you for everyone attending this online book talk. Please read the book Predatory Data. The book is available online for free, and you can also buy the book. And hopefully we can meet 4 of us in person soon. Hopefully in Latin America.
Thank you, Rafael, Esteban, and Paola, for such smart questions, and for the lovely questions as well coming from the audience. I will underscore as well, I should have done that in the beginning, that the open access version is available for anybody to be able to access online for free, and to be able to share openly with open licenses. And that's another benefit as well to getting to work with a nonprofit press. So thank you all again.
Thank you. Have a good day, good evening, depending on your time zone. Bye-bye.